Just kill me, Clara Bennett whispered into the wind. Her knees pressed into the hard Texas dirt, her voice so hollow it barely sounded human. Caleb Whitmore stood 20 feet away on the porch of his weather-beaten ranch house, one hand resting near his belt, the other hanging loose at his side, as if even lifting it required more effort than he cared to give. The late afternoon sun burned low over the plains, stretching long shadows across the fence posts that hadn't heard laughter in over a decade. 12 years was a long time to live with silence. Long enough for a man to forget the sound of his own name spoken kindly. Caleb had buried his wife and little boy after a house fire that left nothing standing but blackened beams and rumors. The town said he was cursed, said trouble followed him like dust behind a wagon. So he moved 5 miles out, where the only judgment came from cattle and sky. He fixed fences. He broke horses. He spoke to no one, and no one came looking. Until today, Clara hadn't meant to collapse at his fence line. She had been walking since dawn, her boots worn thin, her dress torn by mesquite thorns, her breath catching every time she looked over her shoulder. There were hoofprints on the dry earth behind her, not fresh yet not old enough to ignore. When she reached Caleb's property, she hadn't knocked. She hadn't called out. She had simply dropped to her knees as if the ground had finally claimed what little strength she had left. Now she stared at the gun at his hip, not with fear, but with pleading. "Please," she said again, louder this time, though the word cracked halfway through. "Before they do." Caleb's jaw tightened, but his face revealed nothing else. The wind tugged at his coat. Somewhere in the distance, a screen door creaked against its hinge. He had sworn, standing over 2 small graves, that he would never again carry someone else's burden. The world could solve its own troubles. He was done playing savior. Yet here she was, a stranger on her knees, not asking to be rescued, asking to be ended. Caleb turned his head slightly and saw it then, a faint cloud of dust rising near the horizon, maybe 1.5 miles out, moving steady across the flat land toward his ranch. Riders. He measured the distance without thinking. At their pace, they would reach the gate in 10 minutes. Clara saw him glance past her shoulder and closed her eyes, as if that confirmed everything she feared. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling but not loud enough to carry far. "They won't stop." Caleb stepped down from the porch, one slow step at a time, boots pressing into the dirt that had known only his weight for years. He stopped a few feet in front of her. Up close, he could see the exhaustion lining her face, the kind that went deeper than hunger or thirst, the kind that came from losing hope. She expected him to draw the gun, to grant the mercy she thought she wanted. Instead, Caleb looked toward the cabin, then back at the dust cloud inching closer. The plains were wide. The sky was bigger. And for the first time in 12 years, the silence around his ranch felt like it was waiting for him to choose. Caleb did not answer her plea. He simply turned and walked toward the cabin door as if the riders on the horizon were no more than weather rolling in. Clara stared at his back, confused, almost offended by his calm. Men who were afraid moved fast. Men who meant harm moved faster. Caleb moved like a man deciding where to place a fence post. Steady, certain. He pushed the cabin door open and disappeared inside. For a moment, she thought he had abandoned her. The dust cloud behind her was larger now, the shape of 3 riders clear against the pale sky, less than 1 mile away. Her breath grew shallow. She tried to stand, but her legs trembled under her. The porch boards creaked and Caleb stepped out again, carrying a thick wool blanket and a dented tin canteen. He did not look at the riders. He looked at her. He stopped an arm's length away and held out the canteen first. She hesitated, then took it with shaking hands. The water was warm from the heat of the day, but it tasted like something she had almost forgotten. Safety. He draped the blanket over her shoulders without ceremony, without gentleness, yet not roughly either. Just enough. Just human. "Inside," he said quietly, his voice low from years of disuse. It was the first word she had heard him speak. She searched his face for doubt and found none. "You do not know what they will do," she whispered. He glanced once more toward the riders, now perhaps 1/2 mile out, their horses cutting a steady line across his land. "I know what I will do," he replied. The words did not carry anger. They carried weight. Clara felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not hope exactly, but a pause in despair. Caleb guided her toward the cabin steps. Each step felt longer than the last. The wind shifted, carrying faint echoes of distant voices, though she could not make out words. The ranch felt different now, no longer empty, but waiting. Inside, the cabin was simple. A wooden table scarred by years of use. A cast iron stove in the corner. A narrow bed against the far wall. Caleb motioned toward the chair near the table. She sat. He set the canteen down and moved to the window, watching the riders approach his fence line. The horses slowed as they reached the gate. One man dismounted, studying the property as if measuring it. Clara's pulse pounded in her ears. "They will not leave," she said, barely audible. Caleb rested his palm against the window frame, steady as stone. "They are already on my land," he answered. Outside, the gate creaked open. Boots touched dirt. The sound carried clearly in the still air. 3 shadows stretched long across the yard, closing the distance to the porch. Clara's hands tightened around the edge of the blanket. Caleb reached for his hat from the peg by the door and placed it on his head. He did not touch his gun. Not yet. He opened the door and stepped back into the sunlight, pulling it closed behind him. Clara remained inside, heart racing, listening to the measured rhythm of his boots on the porch boards. The silence that followed felt heavier than thunder. Then one of the riders called out, his voice controlled, almost polite. "Afternoon, Whitmore." Caleb did not answer immediately. He stepped down from the porch and stopped between them and the cabin door. The space between them was no more than 10 feet. Close enough to see intent. Far enough to choose it. The wind moved again across the plains, carrying dust and the faint scent of rain somewhere. Far away. And Caleb Whitmore, who had sworn never to stand for anyone again, stood. The 3 men stopped a few feet from Caleb, their horses shifting behind them, leather saddles creaking in the late afternoon heat. The one in front removed his hat, not out of respect, but calculation. He was clean-shaven, his shirt pressed in a way that suggested town rather than trail. "We are looking for a woman," he said evenly. "She wandered onto your property about 15 minutes ago." Caleb did not glance back at the cabin. He kept his eyes on the man's face, reading the lines around his mouth, the patience stretched thin beneath it. "Plenty of land between here and town," Caleb answered. His voice was steady, low, like wind sliding over dry grass. "You might try there." The second rider shifted his weight and studied the porch, the windows, the door that separated them from the quiet inside. "We already tried there," he said. "She belongs with us." Inside the cabin, Clara sat rigid in the wooden chair, every word filtering through the thin walls. "Belongs." The word settled in her chest like a stone. She pressed the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders and forced herself not to move. The leader stepped closer, closing the distance to less than 8 feet. "We are not here for trouble, Whitmore," he said. "Just return what is ours, and we will be on our way." Caleb's gaze did not shift. The ranch around them was silent except for the restless stomp of hooves and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. 12 years ago, he would have measured this moment differently. 12 years ago, he might have weighed the cost in blood and consequence. Now he measured it in something else. In whether a man could live with himself after stepping aside. "Nobody here belongs to anyone," Caleb said at last. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. The third rider gave a short breath of disbelief. "You planning to fight us over a stranger?" he asked. Caleb considered the question without anger. He felt the old ache in his chest, the memory of smoke and helplessness pressing against his ribs. He had stood once before and failed to protect what was his. That failure had followed him every mile since. "I am not planning anything," he replied. She asked to stay. It was not the whole truth, but it was the only part that mattered. The leader's eyes narrowed slightly. "You think you know her story?" he asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I do not need to." The wind shifted again, carrying the scent of dry earth and something distant that hinted at rain miles away. The men exchanged glances, silent calculations passing between them. They had expected resistance perhaps, but not this kind. Not quiet. Not unshaken. The leader studied Caleb a moment longer, then looked toward the cabin door once more. "You are choosing a hard road," he said. Caleb did not move. "The easy ones are crowded," he answered. The horses shifted again. The silence stretched, heavy and unresolved. Inside, Clara closed her eyes, waiting for the sound that would decide everything. Outside, Caleb Whitmore stood between 3 determined men and the only door that mattered, and for the first time in 12 years, he did not step back. The leader let the silence breathe for several long seconds, then placed his hat back on his head with slow deliberation. "You are mistaken, Whitmore," he said, his tone cooling. "The woman inside that cabin signed an agreement. She owes a debt. We are here to collect it." Caleb did not flinch. The word debt hung in the air like dust that refused to settle. He had heard that word before in town, usually spoken by men who believed paper carried more weight than conscience. "Debts are settled in town," Caleb replied, "not dragged across open land." The second rider gave a faint, humorless smile. "She ran from responsibility," he said. "You sheltering her makes you part of it." Caleb's gaze drifted briefly to the horizon, measuring the distance to the nearest neighbor, knowing it was more than 3 miles of empty pasture. No help would ride in. No witness would record what happened here except the sky. Inside the cabin, Clara's hands trembled against the blanket. Agreement. Debt. The words cut deeper than any threat. She had signed something, yes. A paper placed before her after her father passed, when grief made her careless and trust too easy. She had believed promises spoken across a polished desk in town. Promises of work, of protection, of stability. The reality had felt smaller each day after. Smaller until breathing itself felt like disobedience. Caleb shifted his stance. Slightly, boots settling into the dirt. "If she owes you," he said calmly, "she can speak it herself." The leader's eyes hardened. "We will speak to her when we step inside." Caleb shook his head once. A small motion, but final. "You will not." The third rider glanced toward the horses, uneasy now. The wind picked up, lifting strands of dust between them, blurring outlines for a heartbeat before settling again. The ranch felt like a border drawn in invisible ink. The leader took one slow step forward, closing the gap to less than 6 feet. "You think you are protecting her," he said quietly. "You do not know what she agreed to." Caleb met his stare without raising his voice. "I know she asked for mercy." The leader studied him as if trying to locate the weakness that must exist. "Mercy is not your business," he said. Caleb's jaw tightened just enough to be noticed. "Out here," he answered, "it is the only business that matters." Inside, Clara heard the words, and something shifted in her chest. For the first time since dawn, her breathing slowed. Not because danger had passed, but because someone had spoken on her behalf without asking what she could offer in return. Outside, the tension thickened. The riders had expected fear, negotiation, perhaps even surrender. They had not expected a man who had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing to bargain with. The leader exhaled slowly and looked past Caleb at the cabin door one last time. "This is not finished," he said. Caleb nodded once. "It is for today." The wind moved again across the pasture, brushing against fence posts and tall grass. The men stood still for a moment longer, measuring pride against practicality. Then the leader turned toward his horse, his boots pressing deep into the dust. Caleb did not relax. He did not move from his place between them and the door. Not until the first rider reached for his reins and the balance of the afternoon began to shift. The first rider swung into his saddle without breaking eye contact, leather groaning under his weight, but he did not spur the horse forward just yet. The leader lingered a moment longer, boots planted in Caleb's dirt as though he wanted the ground itself to remember the visit. "You are buying her time," he said evenly. "Time runs out." Caleb did not answer. He simply watched as the third man mounted up, reins drawn tight, horses turning slow circles that stirred thin spirals of dust. The ranch felt suspended, like the air before a storm that might never come. Inside the cabin, Clara remained frozen in the chair, listening to each creak of saddle leather, each soft snort of a restless horse. She counted heartbeats instead of seconds. 1, 2, 3. The leader finally turned, placed his boot in the stirrup, and pulled himself up with a controlled motion. He settled into the saddle and adjusted his hat against the sun. For a long breath, the 3 riders sat facing Caleb, measuring him in silence. Then, without another word, they nudged their horses toward the open gate. Hooves pressed into the dry earth, steady and unhurried, as if they were confident the road would curve back here soon enough. Caleb did not move until the riders crossed the fence line and the distance between them stretched beyond shouting range. Even then, he remained still, watching until they became shapes against the flat horizon, then shadows, then dust. Only when the land swallowed them did he release the breath he had been holding. The quiet returned slowly, settling over the ranch like a blanket laid across tired shoulders. Caleb turned and climbed the porch steps, each board answering with a low creak beneath his boots. He opened the cabin door and stepped inside. Clara looked up at him, eyes wide, uncertain whether to speak or remain invisible. He removed his hat and set it on the table. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The room smelled faintly of coffee grounds and old wood smoke. "They will come back," she said finally, her voice small but steady. Caleb nodded once. Most men do when pride is involved. She studied him as if trying to understand what kind of man would risk his solitude for a stranger. "You do not even know me," she whispered. Caleb moved to the window and looked out across the pasture where the dust had already begun to settle. "I know enough," he said. Clara lowered her gaze to her hands, the faint marks around her wrists catching the fading light. "I signed a paper," she admitted quietly. "After my father died. I thought it meant work. Protection. I did not read the fine lines." Her voice trembled but did not break. Caleb listened without interruption. He had seen enough of town dealings to understand how ink could bind tighter than rope. "Paper can say many things," he replied. "It does not decide what is right." Clara looked at him again, something fragile flickering in her expression. Outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying the promise of cooler air as evening approached. The world had not changed in the last 15 minutes. The plains were still wide. The sky was still mercilessly open. Yet inside that small cabin, something had shifted. Caleb Whitmore, who had spent 12 years avoiding every burden that was not his own, had drawn a line in the dirt. And he knew lines, once drawn, rarely disappeared without consequence. Evening settled slow over the ranch, turning the wide Texas sky from pale gold to bruised violet, and Caleb lit the oil lamp on the table without a word. The small flame flickered against the wooden walls, throwing long shadows that swayed like ghosts who had not decided whether to stay. Clara remained seated, the wool blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, though the air had cooled. She watched him move with quiet efficiency, the way a man moves when he has lived alone long enough to measure every step. He poured water into a tin cup and placed it in front of her. Not close enough to crowd her, not far enough to seem distant. "They will not forget this," she said softly, staring at the flame instead of him. Caleb pulled out the opposite chair and sat, forearms resting on his knees. "No," he answered. "They will not." The truth hung between them, plain and unadorned. Outside, a lone cow lowed in the pasture, unaware that anything had shifted in the human world. Clara swallowed and finally looked up. "I never meant to run this far," she admitted. "I thought if I could reach the county line, someone would listen." Caleb studied her face in the lamplight. The exhaustion there was real. So was the fear. But beneath it, he saw something else. Resolve. "Town listens to whoever speaks loudest," he said. "Out here, it listens to whoever stands." Clara let those words settle. She had spent months believing that paper defined her fate, that a signature written in grief could erase her will. Yet today a man who owed her nothing had simply refused to step aside. She hesitated, then reached into the pocket of her torn dress and pulled out a folded document, creased and worn from being opened too many times. She placed it on the table between them. Caleb looked at it, but did not touch it. "That is what they want," she said. "It says I agreed to work off a debt. It says I am bound until it is paid." Her voice trembled only slightly now. But the numbers never shrink. They only grow. Caleb finally reached forward and laid his rough hand over the paper, not to claim it, but to steady it against the faint draft slipping through the cabin walls. "Ink can be stretched," he said quietly. "So can truth." Clara studied him, searching for doubt, for regret. She found neither. "Why?" she asked after a long pause. "Why would you risk this for me?" Caleb leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking beneath his weight. He stared at the flame as if it held an answer older than either of them. "Because once," he said slowly, "I needed someone to stand." The words were simple. He did not explain further. He did not have to. The silence that followed was not heavy anymore. It was different. Outside, the wind shifted direction again, brushing against the cabin walls like a reminder that morning would come whether they were ready or not. Clara folded her hands in her lap and drew a deeper breath than she had taken all day. The riders would return. The paper would not vanish overnight. But something inside that small cabin had already changed. Caleb Whitmore had chosen a road he swore he would never walk again. And this time, he did not intend to turn back. Night deepened around the cabin, and the oil lamp burned lower, its flame steady but small, as if conserving strength for what might come at dawn. Caleb remained seated at the table, the folded paper still beneath his hand, while Clara watched him with a mixture of disbelief and quiet gratitude she did not yet know how to name. Outside, the ranch lay under a sky crowded with stars, wide and indifferent. Coyotes called somewhere far off, their voices thin and lonely, echoing across miles of open land. Caleb finally lifted the document and unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases. With calloused fingers, he read each line slowly, lips pressed into a firm line, eyes moving without hurry. The numbers were written in neat ink. The language was polished. It spoke of opportunity and obligation, of housing provided and wages advanced. It did not speak of pressure or fear. It did not speak of promises whispered when grief made everything sound reasonable. Clara studied his face as he read, searching for judgment. Instead, she saw something colder. Recognition. They increased it, she said quietly. Each month they added fees. Food. Lodging. Interest. Caleb nodded once, still scanning the page. A debt that grows no matter how much you pay is not a debt, he said at last. It is a leash. The words settled between them. Clara looked down at her hands again, remembering the office in town, the polished desk, the steady voice that had assured her everything was proper. She had believed stability was worth a signature. She had not realized the cost would be her freedom. Caleb folded the paper again, slower this time, and placed it back on the table. Do they hold copies? He asked. Clara swallowed. Yes. In town. At the office near the general store. Caleb leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling beams darkened by years of smoke. Town was 5 miles east. A half-day's ride if taken slow. Less if a man pushed his horse. He had not ridden into town for anything beyond supplies in years, and even then he kept his visits short and his words shorter. If they return tomorrow, Clara said carefully, they will not come alone. Caleb gave a faint nod. Men who trade in paper rarely stand alone. Silence followed, but it was no longer heavy with fear. It felt measured, like two people studying a map neither had expected to share. Clara drew the blanket tighter around herself, though she felt warmer than before. You could still send me away at first light, she said softly. No one would blame you. Caleb looked at her then, truly looked, and something in his expression shifted. Blame is not the measure, he replied. Living with yourself is. The lamp flame flickered as a draft slipped under the door, and Caleb rose to secure the latch. He checked the window, then paused with his hand resting against the wood. 12 years of silence had taught him how to survive alone. It had not taught him how to ignore a wrong placed directly at his doorstep. He turned back toward Clara. At dawn, he said, voice calm and certain, we ride to town. Clara's breath caught, not from fear this time, but from the weight of what that meant. Facing the paper, facing the men behind it, facing a place that had looked away. Outside, the wind moved across the pasture once more, carrying the scent of distant rain. And inside the small cabin, a decision had been made that would carry them far beyond its wooden walls. Before sunrise, the ranch was wrapped in a thin gray hush, the kind that makes even restless cattle stand still. Caleb was already outside, tightening the saddle straps on his bay gelding, movements precise and unhurried. The air carried a bite of early morning cold, sharp enough to wake a man fully. Clara stepped out of the cabin doorway, the folded paper tucked safely inside her coat. She paused on the porch, watching him in the dim light. He had said they would ride to town, and he had not spoken another word about it. No speeches, no reassurances, just action. The eastern horizon began to pale, a faint band of silver cutting across the wide Texas sky. Caleb handed her a pair of worn gloves. The road is rough in spots, he said quietly. She accepted them, surprised again by the absence of hesitation in him. Minutes later they were mounted, the ranch shrinking behind them as the horses settled into a steady pace. 5 miles was not far in distance, but it felt longer when the purpose was heavier than supplies or cattle feed. The dirt road stretched ahead, winding through dry grass and scattered mesquite. Clara kept her eyes forward, though every so often she glanced back, half expecting to see dust rising behind them. There was none, only open land and morning light. "They will be waiting," she said after a mile had passed in silence. Caleb did not look at her. "Maybe," he answered. "But so will others." She frowned slightly. "Others?" Caleb nodded toward the distant outline of town, barely visible against the brightening sky. "Men who sign papers need witnesses," he said. "They prefer quiet rooms, not public ones." Clara understood then. He did not intend to argue in private. He intended to bring daylight into it. The road dipped into a shallow creek bed, dry this time of year, and the horses picked their way carefully over loose stones. The rhythm of hooves against earth was steady, almost calming. Clara felt something she had not felt in months. Not safety, not yet, but direction. They crested the last rise before town, just as the sun broke fully over the horizon, washing the wooden storefronts in gold. Smoke began to rise from a few chimneys. The general store sign creaked gently in the breeze. Life was waking. Caleb slowed his horse at the edge of town, scanning the street with quiet assessment. A few early risers glanced their way, curiosity flickering across familiar faces that rarely saw him ride in at dawn. He guided his horse toward the building Clara had described, the office near the general store with the polished window and neatly painted door. The same door that had once promised her stability. He dismounted without flourish and tied the reins to the hitching post. Clara followed, her pulse quickening as her boots touched the wooden boardwalk. The town felt smaller now than it had in her memory, as if daylight exposed its flaws. Caleb removed his hat and looked at her once, not for permission, not for doubt, but for readiness. She gave a slight nod. The folded paper rested against her heart. The door to the office stood closed, but smoke curled from the chimney. Someone was inside. Caleb stepped forward and placed his hand on the handle. The morning air held still, as if the town itself were waiting to see whether ink or conscience would speak first. Caleb pushed the office door open without force, the small brass bell above it giving a single clear ring that echoed sharper than it should have in the quiet morning. The room smelled of ink and fresh coffee, a neat desk positioned near the window where sunlight already spilled across polished wood. Behind it sat a man in a pressed vest, sleeves rolled just enough to appear industrious. He looked up slowly, surprise flickering across his face before smoothing into a practiced smile. "Whitmore," he said, as if greeting a rare customer. His eyes shifted to Clara, and the smile thinned. "Miss Bennet." Clara felt the weight of that gaze, but did not lower her head this time. Caleb stepped inside fully, leaving the door open behind him so the street remained visible, so voices outside could carry in if needed. Two townsmen paused near the general store across the way, curiosity pulling them closer without their admitting it. Caleb removed his hat and held it at his side. "We came about the agreement," he said evenly. The man behind the desk leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "There is nothing unclear about it," he replied. Miss Bennet signed willingly. Clara reached into her coat and placed her copy of the folded document on the desk. The paper made a soft sound as it touched the polished surface. "I signed in grief," she said, voice steady though her hands trembled. "And the numbers changed after." The man gave a patient sigh, as if addressing a child. "Expenses accrue," he said. "That is how business works." Caleb stepped closer to the desk, not in threat, but in presence. "Then we will review the ledger," he said. The man's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is private record." Caleb did not raise his voice. So is a man's conscience. The bell above the door rang again as one of the townsmen wandered in under the pretense of browsing a notice pinned to the wall. Another followed moments later. The office felt smaller now, not because of walls, but because of witnesses. The man behind the desk adjusted his collar. "This is unnecessary," he said quietly. Caleb met his gaze. "Then it should be simple." Clara watched as the tension shifted, no longer three riders on open land, but something subtler. Reputation. Image. The man hesitated, then reached for a thick ledger book from a shelf behind him. He placed it on the desk with care, as though it were fragile. Caleb did not touch it. "Read it aloud," he said. The man's jaw tightened. Outside, more footsteps slowed near the open door, drawn by the unusual sight of Caleb Whitmore standing in daylight for something other than feed or nails. The ledger opened, pages turning, numbers written in neat columns. The man cleared his throat and began to read. Charges for lodging. Charges for meals. Charges for equipment. Each line spoken into air that no longer felt private. Clara listened closely, her heart pounding, waiting for the moment when ink would reveal what fear had hidden. Caleb stood unmoving beside her, silent as fence post in wind. The morning sun climbed higher, brightening the room, leaving fewer places for shadows to hide. The man's voice grew tighter as he continued reading from the ledger, each number sounding less confident than the last. Charges repeated in different columns. Interest calculated twice in the same month. Supplies listed that Clara had never received. The townsmen inside the office shifted their weight, exchanging glances they did not bother to hide. Sunlight poured fully through the front window now, laying bare every line of ink on the open page. "Read that one again," Caleb said quietly, pointing to an entry dated 3 weeks after Clara had signed. The man hesitated, then cleared his throat. "Equipment maintenance fee," he read. Clara frowned. "There was no equipment," she said, her voice steady. "I worked in the boarding house kitchen." A murmur rippled through the small room. Caleb did not look at the onlookers. He kept his eyes on the ledger. "And the week after?" he asked. The man turned the page reluctantly. "Late payment penalty," he answered. Clara's brow tightened. "I was never told a payment date," she said. The man's composure began to thin. "These are standard adjustments," he insisted, though his tone lacked the polish it had held earlier. Caleb rested his palm flat on the desk, not in anger, but in finality. "Standard for whom?" he asked. The bell above the door rang again as another figure stepped inside, drawn by the gathering crowd. The office no longer felt like private territory. It felt like a courtroom without a judge. The ledger lay open between them, no longer a symbol of authority, but of exposure. Caleb turned one more page and stopped. "Here," he said, tapping a line written in darker ink than the rest. "This total does not match the columns above it." The man leaned forward quickly. "That is a clerical correction," he replied. "Made in good faith." Caleb's gaze lifted slowly to meet his. "Then you will not object to correcting it again." The words were calm, almost gentle. The townsmen stood silent, waiting. Clara felt her pulse in her throat, but she did not look away this time. The man behind the desk glanced toward the open door, then at the faces watching him. Reputation was a fragile thing in a town this small. Ink could bind a woman, but it could also unravel a man. He closed the ledger halfway, fingers resting on its edge. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "there have been misunderstandings." Caleb did not respond. He simply waited. The silence stretched long enough for the truth to weigh heavier than pride. Finally, the man reached for a pen, dipped it in ink, and drew a single line through the inflated total. The scratch of metal against paper sounded louder than any raised voice. Clara exhaled slowly, as if she had been holding her breath for months. The man wrote a new figure beneath the old one, smaller, reasonable, no longer endless. He looked up at Clara, the practiced smile gone. "With this adjustment," he said, "your obligation is considered settled." The room remained quiet. Caleb lifted his hand from the desk and stepped back, giving the man space to close his own book. Outside, the town resumed its morning rhythm, unaware that something larger than numbers had just shifted inside a small office washed in sunlight. The man behind the desk closed the ledger slowly, as if sealing something more than numbers inside its worn leather cover. The scratch of ink had ended the debt, but it had not erased the room's memory. Clara stood still, absorbing the weight of the words settled. Obligation considered settled. For a moment she did not trust them. She had lived too long under figures that never shrank. Caleb remained beside her, hat in hand, posture relaxed but unwavering. He did not smile. He did not gloat. He simply nodded once, the way a man does when a fence post finally stands straight after being driven deep enough. One of the townsmen near the door cleared his throat. "Seems fair," he muttered, not loudly, but loud enough. The others shifted in agreement. The office no longer belonged to the man behind the desk. It belonged to daylight and witnesses. Clara reached forward and gently pulled her copy of the agreement back toward her. The paper felt lighter now, though it weighed the same in ounces. She folded it carefully, not out of fear this time, but closure. The man behind the desk adjusted his vest and attempted to restore his composure. "Miss Bennett," he said, voice measured, "you are free to seek employment elsewhere." The phrasing was deliberate. as if he were granting a favor rather than returning what was. Never his to hold. Clara met his eyes without lowering her gaze. I was always free, she said quietly. The words did not accuse. They did not shout. They simply existed. A faint flush rose along the man's collar. Caleb stepped back another pace, creating space for Clara to stand on her own. He had not come to speak for her forever, only long enough for her voice to be heard. Outside, the street had grown busier. Wagons rolled past. A child's laughter drifted through the open door. Life continued, unaware that something fundamental had shifted in the balance of one small town. Clara turned toward Caleb. For a heartbeat, she looked as though she might say thank you, might try to put into words what standing beside her had meant. Caleb gave a slight shake of his head, almost imperceptible. Gratitude was not the point. She understood. Together they stepped out onto the wooden boardwalk. The sun stood higher now, warming the planks beneath their boots. People watched, not openly staring, but aware. A story had already begun to travel without being told. Caleb paused at the hitching post and untied the reins. Clara rested her hand briefly against the saddle leather, steadying herself. You did not have to do this, she said softly. Caleb placed his hat back on his head and looked down the main street, where dust lifted gently in the morning light. Yes, he replied, voice calm and certain. I did. There was no pride in it. No heroism. Only recognition. Clara mounted her horse with less hesitation than she had shown at dawn. The town behind them seemed smaller now, its buildings less imposing beneath the clear sky. As they rode toward the edge of the street, the bell above the office door rang faintly again, though neither of them turned back. Some battles ended not with raised fists or drawn weapons, but with a single line of ink crossed out in front of witnesses. And sometimes that was enough. They rode out of town without hurry, the sound of hooves against packed dirt steady and unremarkable, as though nothing unusual had occurred that morning. The sun climbed higher, warming the backs of their coats, stretching their shadows long behind them. For the first mile neither of them spoke. The town shrank at their backs, its wooden storefronts fading into pale shapes against the open land. Clara felt the difference in her chest before she understood it in words. The road ahead no longer felt like escape. It felt like choice. Caleb kept his gaze forward, hands relaxed on the reins, posture as steady as when he had stood in his own yard facing 3 riders. He did not look like a man who had won anything. He looked like a man who had simply corrected something crooked. After a while Clara guided her horse a little closer to his. What happens now? She asked quietly. Caleb considered the question without rushing to fill it. Now, he said, you decide where you want to stand. The answer was simple, but it carried weight. Clara looked across the open pasture rolling beside them, the dry grass bending under a steady breeze. I do not have much, she admitted. No land. No savings. Caleb nodded once. You have your name, he replied. And it is not written in that ledger anymore. They reached the shallow creek bed again, the horses stepping carefully over stone and dust. Clara remembered how tight her chest had felt on the way into town, how each hoofbeat had sounded like a countdown. Now the rhythm felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but clearer. They will not try again, she asked. Caleb glanced briefly toward the horizon. Not the same way, he answered. Men who depend on quiet do not enjoy noise. Clara allowed herself a faint, uncertain smile. The ranch came into view as they crested the final rise, its small cabin standing alone against miles of sky. Yesterday, it had looked isolated. Today it looked solid. As they approached the fence line, Caleb slowed his horse and dismounted, opening the gate with the same unremarkable care he gave to everything else. Clara watched him for a moment before following. The wind moved through the pasture, carrying the scent of sun-warmed grass. She slid from the saddle and stood beside him, boots settling into the familiar dirt. I can leave, she said softly. Find work somewhere else. I do not want to bring trouble to your door. Caleb closed the gate and rested his forearm along the top rail, looking out over his land. 12 years of solitude had taught him the comfort of emptiness. But emptiness was not the same as peace. Trouble finds doors whether they are open or closed, he said calmly. What matters is who is standing behind them. Clara felt the truth of that settle in her bones. The cabin stood a few yards away, quiet and unchanged, yet everything felt different. She stepped closer to the porch and ran her hand lightly along the weathered wood, grounding herself in something real. Caleb untied the saddle blanket and carried it toward the barn without another word. He did not offer her promises. He did not offer her plans. He offered space. The kind of space where a person could choose to stay. And for the first time since her father passed, Clara did not feel owned by paper or pursued by shadows. She felt the weight of a decision resting in her own hands. Out on the open plains, that was more than most ever received. That evening the ranch felt different, though nothing visible had changed. The same fence posts leaned slightly against the wind. The same cattle moved slow across the pasture. The same sky stretched wide and unbothered above them. But when the sun began to sink, washing the plains in copper light, Clara was still there. She had not packed. She had not walked back toward the road. Instead, she stood beside the water trough, sleeves rolled, helping Caleb draw a fresh bucket from the well, as if she had always known how. He did not comment on her staying. He simply handed her the rope and let her find her balance with it. Work, out here, was not a promise. It was participation. As dusk deepened, they sat on the porch steps, a few feet apart, watching the horizon swallow the last edge of sun. The wind moved through the tall grass with a steady whisper, carrying the scent of earth cooling after a long day. Clara held the folded paper in her hands one final time. She looked at the crossed-out number, at the ink that had once felt like a chain. Without ceremony, she fed it into the small flame of the lantern beside her. The edges curled first, then darkened, then turned to ash that drifted away on the breeze. Caleb watched without interruption. Some things did not need commentary. When the paper was gone, Clara rested her hands in her lap, palms open, as if testing the absence of weight. I thought freedom would feel louder, she said softly. Caleb leaned back against the porch post, eyes on the darkening fields. It rarely does, he replied. It just feels steady. Silence settled between them, not awkward, not strained, just shared. In the distance, a lone rider crossed far beyond the boundary of the ranch, too distant to threaten, too small to matter. The world would continue with its ledgers and agreements and men who mistook ink for authority. But here, on this patch of land 5 miles from town, a different rule held. No one was owned. No one was reduced to a number on a page. Clara turned her gaze toward the small barn, the weathered cabin, the open gate that now stood closed for the night. If I stay, she said carefully, I will earn my place. Caleb nodded once. That is the only way it works. There was no grand declaration, no vow, just understanding. The stars emerged one by one overhead, bright and patient. 12 years ago, Caleb Whitmore had believed silence was the only way to survive loss. He had walled himself off from need, from obligation, from the risk of caring. But that afternoon in town, he had stood not for land or pride, but for a woman who refused to be erased by fine print. And in doing so, he had broken something else free inside himself. Clara rose at last and stepped toward the cabin door. Before entering, she paused and looked back at him. He did not smile, but his eyes were no longer shadowed the way they had been the morning she first arrived. Out on the plains, justice had not come with raised voices or drawn weapons. It had come with a line of ink crossed out in daylight, with a man who chose to stand, and with a woman who chose not to kneel again. The wind moved softly across the porch, and the ranch settled into night, quiet and unafraid.